So far, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from scholars. My expertise is more that of an advocate. Therefore, you will hear me saying some things with which you might not agree. I make no bones about being biased, Hoosier chauvinism for Indiana limestone. I've been asked to discuss some obvious but unpleasant facts about limestone, starting with the decline of the industries in the 30s, its present importance and its future. I've been asked to compare it to other materials, asked to answer the question whether Indiana limestone is at war with modernism in architecture, to discuss the impact of architectural fashion changes, the effect of the promotional activities of the limestone industry, the environmental advantages and disadvantages in the use of limestone in architecture, and like previous speakers, I've got 20 minutes to cover this, which is a pretty good sized order. And having established my credentials as a biased observer, let me say that the thing I need, I think, to emphasize in that phrase is observer. I've been in the business approaching 20 years, and the changes in architecture and in construction that I've seen in that short tenure are grinding, and they make me angry. I find that changes from the standpoint of the relatively quiet industry that I knew when I came into it, in spite of the fact that the use of limestone, even at that time, had declined considerably and continued to decline. The use of limestone to date, in my short tenure, causes me to wonder whether architecture and the proponents of the various styles of architecture, to wonder whose ends they are serving. But let me get to that. We have an architect in the house, and I certainly don't want to step on his toes. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say some complimentary things about him a little later. Indiana limestone's history, for the purpose of my discussion, starts, say, in 1935. The Depression didn't really start for the limestone industry until about that time. 1929 was the big financial crunch, and it was also the period during which major building contracts were being let, with the result that 35 was probably a peak year. If a man was looking for a job in this area at that time, the chances were pretty good that he would be able to find work in the Indiana limestone industry. I wonder if I could have my first slide, please. And I don't want the lights too low. These other fellows knew what they were talking about, and I've got to read my notes. Maybe a little lower than that. Maybe a little lower than that yet. Okay. My notes have disappeared, so you just have to put up with me.
Somebody's coming to your rescue. With a light.
Oh. She may break a leg. Thank you. Very good. I appreciate that. From 1940 through 45, of course, were the war years, and the Indiana limestone industry turned in large measure to war production. The tooling in the Indiana limestone industry mills was not difficult to change from stone to metalwork, and was not difficult to change back in 45 through 49, which were really pretty much the last good years in the Indiana limestone industry. We tend to think, we in this district of, that is those not associated with the Indiana limestone industry, of the industry as being located in that area that Dr. Patton indicated. And while that is true from the standpoint of production, often we fail to realize that these huge quarry blocks are not consumed only in the United States, but in this area, but are consumed by fabricators over the entire country, or at least the eastern two-thirds of the country, terminating usage, I guess, at the Rocky Mountains. There were, up to the period that I'm talking about, some 250 fabricators, both in and out of the Indiana limestone belt, as far away as Phoenix, Arizona, Boston, Massachusetts, Binghamton, New York. So it has been a very widespread industry from the standpoint of those people who fabricated Indiana limestone. Along came 1949. As I said, 1949 was among the last of the good years of the Indiana limestone industry, and it was, in a sense, a year of departures. It was the year of the Seagram's building, built by Mies van der Rohe, and it represented the landing of a shot that had been fired 27 years earlier by, if not Mies van der Rohe, by people who belonged to his architectural school. But let me not speak for him. Let me quote what Mies van der Rohe said in 1924. I am, in fact, quoting what Peter Blake said, Mies van der Rohe said in 1924, but I've read this statement before and I know it to be accurate. The industrialization of building methods is the key problem for architects and builders. This is 1924. Once we succeed in this, our social, economic, technical, and even our artistic problems will be easy to solve. The nature of the building process will not change as long as we employ essentially the same, he's speaking of traditional, building materials, for they require hand labor. Our first consideration must be to find a new building material. Our technologists must and will succeed in inventing a material which can be industrially manufactured and processed, and which will be weatherproof, soundproof, and insulating. It must be a light material which not only permits but requires industrial production. Then the new architecture will come into its own. I'm now quoting Peter Blake. What Mies van der Rohe was saying, in effect, is that the new architecture, as he called it, could only come into its own if industry provided an entirely new range of building materials: plain, smooth, hard-edged, pure, precise, and impervious to just about everything. He was saying, in effect, that unless modern industry came up with such modern miracles, modern architecture was sunk. Now, I'll get back to that after a while, because what I wanted to establish here was that this is an example of what I consider to be the architectural arrogance which characterizes our age. I'm speaking now in terms of decades from let's use 24 through what should have been 1973 but continues to this day. Indiana limestone, to compare with other materials, I'd like to have the next 10 slides, and don't let me give you a signal on them. Just give us about 5 seconds each on each of these slides. We're looking at copies of architectural magazines, and I have violated the copyright laws by simply taking pictures of architectural magazines to illustrate what architects look at and what kinds of what that has to do with architecture, I have no idea. What materials are presented to architects by architectural record and progressive architecture, what buildings are said by them to be, these are the kinds of buildings that should be emulated. Okay, leave her there. We've got a black slide, and that's where I wanted to get to. I want to give you another quotation. This one a little longer, but by a living man. A fellow in the American Institute of Architects who practices currently in New Orleans, and whom I heard make this statement as part of a very impassioned speech in New Orleans not too long ago. His name is Charles Colbert. Mr. Colbert states in part, "Perhaps because of the loose levity of our time, God gave the designer the energy crisis. Now, perhaps essential needs can be placed before the gadget, skill considered before dexterity, and reality put ahead of appearance. The uniform homogenization of materials was born of cheap heat energy. In recent years, the designer has been literally buried in materials of strange characteristics and limited life. Lasting a year or so, they are usually little better or worse than last year's promotion. Often logically begun by efforts to utilize scraps and process waste, they have usually degenerated to barest sufficiency. The natural quantities of materials are rare in current building. Chipboard, paper laminates, and compressed derivatives have replaced natural wood, stone, and weathering materials. These ill-matched materials constituents conform to our transient acceptance of our new decalcomania group-oriented society. Grinding, rolling, mixing, compressing, expanding, pulverizing, bonding, liquefying, extruding, stripping, and other chemical changes and mechanical combining of components are so prevalent and of such heterogeneous ingredients that the designer is unable to recognize or keep abreast of basic characteristics. Of equal concern, these new products move into and out of the marketplace so fast that the test of time and actual application is seldom possible, and only questionable test data is available. Major failures appear with regularity. Roof membranes prematurely crack. Chipboards swell and do not hold screws. Sun-exposed anodized metals fade. Lightweight aggregates fatigue and fail. Caulking cracks and crazes, and similar failures occur with accelerating speed. Except for marginal savings in first cost, few of these new ersatz materials equal the quality of those used earlier. First cost is their only possible justification. Limited life buildings become more and more common, not because of obsolete functional capacity or real cost, but due to the apparent necessity of our artificial technology and economic system. Contrary to much popular opinion, it is not functional obsolescence that destroys our buildings' usefulness, but the general acceptance of transient, profit-centered building systems and inferior materials. Better materials can obviously be made today than ever before, but they do not meet the artificial demands of a callous marketplace. Permanent slate, copper, and lead roofs must give way to limited life asphalt shingles, not because of cost, but to allow repetitive profits. In terms of human advantage, the pyramids, by our standards, might have been made of fabric and either continually maintained or repeatedly rebuilt. Okay, that is one man's opinion, and I need now to begin to say some good things about Indiana limestone, because that's what we're here to talk about. But these factors hook together. So let me have the next slide, please. This is the book from which I quoted, and the author, Peter Blake, has taken the architectural dictum, form follows function, and written a book called Form Follows Fiasco. What he's saying is why modern architecture hasn't worked. Now, while we're looking at that, let me say this about Indiana limestone. And these are in negative terms. Indiana limestone doesn't rot, warp, peel, shrink, crack, check, or jump out of the wall. It just sits there. And that is probably the most desirable quality in a building material. Just sit there for centuries, if need be. Indiana limestone is one of the traditional materials of which Mies van der Rohe spoke. Let me answer the question, is Indiana limestone at war with modernism? Let's flip through these slides briefly now. This is, by definition, as modern a building as the Seagram's building. These are cast iron storefronts in Lower Manhattan, built around 1840 by James Bogardus and certain followers. And they are systems buildings. You can't tell them from, in this photograph, from what might be stone buildings, but they are cast iron, and anybody that's been in Lower Manhattan is familiar with these cast iron buildings, built of glass and steel in 1949, and the equal, technologically, of any of the glass skyscrapers today. So you start out questioning the term modern architecture. Let me have the next slide, please. This is Pruitt Ego public housing in St. Louis, and it was dynamited finally because it was unlivable. The buildings were designed and built by architects who thought they knew how people lived, and the final decision on the part of the federal government was, rather than put more money into guards on every floor, they simply dynamited the buildings. May I have the next slide, please? This is the John Hancock building, the world's tallest plywood skyscraper. Built by an architect, designed by an architect with a fine international reputation, a good general contractor, material furnished by fine subcontractors and put together at the direction of an excellent engineer, and none of them knew how come the glass fell out of the wall, which it continues to do. Let's have the next one, please. This is the geodesic dome built for Expo 67 in Montreal. Now, the geodesic dome is credited generally to Buckminster Fuller, and he never made the claims for it that were made for this form of building, that this is the building to end all be all. But something went wrong. Let's have the next one, please. This is an example of architectural thinking. What we're looking at here is a combination of materials put together with this fastener, and here again I'm quoting Peter Blake, to put this kind of a system together, a man need have only a doctorate in Chinese puzzling. The designer apparently had never heard of the nail. Let's have the next slide, please. Joints are a problem, there's no question about that, in building materials. Putting one material next to another and making certain that it stays there and doesn't let water and outside air in and cool or warmed inside air out is one of the problems with which architects deal. Here, the architect dealt with it one time. Let me have the next slide, please. At Owen Hall in 1884. Those mortar joints holding together bricks have been sitting there ever since. Let me have the next one, please. Even Owen Hall is not sacrosanct, however. Here, the very attractive Italianate facade has been scarified by the addition of the little flat-roofed building which you see to the right, and predictably the roof leaks there. It might be interesting at this stage. No, let me have the next slide. This is a shot. Here again, I'm violating copyright laws. This is a shot from a engineering news record recently. The Kennedy Center, as you may not have read, has a leaking roof, and it's only going to cost you $3.4 million to get it fixed. George Washington wrote the following to his Mount Vernon caretaker regarding a choice of roofing materials. He was speaking of a roofing failure. He must be a miserable artisan, or a very great rascal indeed, who after one experiment could not tell what kind of shingles were necessary to prevent a common roof from leaking, or how to place them as they ought to be. Of course, George did not have to deal with flat roofs. That's one of my tenets. Flat roofs don't work. They leak. It's none of my business, really. Walls of Indiana limestone or brick or masonry materials, but particularly for the purpose of this session, Indiana limestone, just sit there. And what happens to the roof doesn't really make any difference, and the roof can literally collapse, and in many cases does, and the walls are ready to be have another roof put on them. Is Indiana limestone at war with modernism? No. It's my considered personal opinion that the school, modernism in architecture, is at war with society. Let me have the next slide, please. Indiana limestone can deal with modernism. This is a modern detail on a building at Butler University, or this next one, please, which is a post-tension tower, bell tower of Indiana limestone. And the next slide should be a black one. My instructions here are to read a quote from architect Harry Weiss in Chicago. Architect Weiss says, "If present-day architecture is ever to mature, it needs to eschew the fashion of the hour and consider the realities of decades. The art of building is not relearned every generation. It is an ongoing thing. The joy and stimulus in architecture is the discovery of fresh combinations of old ingredients appropriate to present problems. Faced with the choice, I would rather be right than contemporary." Now, the fact is that using old and tried methods and old and tried materials, an architect can be both right and contemporary. I.J. Good said, "It is often better to be stimulating and wrong than boring and right," but I.J. Good didn't build buildings. The impact of changes in architectural fashion. It would be foolish to say that there had not been such an impact. From rows of handsome gargoyles and griffins, we now have flat roofs. And this marks me pretty well as an antediluvian troglodyte, I admit it. Buildings were handsomer then than they are now. And part of the reason that buildings were handsomer was because they worked. Let me have the next slides, please. This is the City Hall Annex here in Bloomington. As you can see, it has a flat roof, and it is graced with a classic of some sorts window, kneelers over the door. And the next one. Here's another modern detail which could have been concrete and started out being concrete, as a matter of fact, but was changed to Indiana limestone by some of the efforts of the Indiana limestone industry. The next slide illustrates a building in Milwaukee, the Blue Cross building, which we made the old college try on and failed. So yeah, Indiana limestone has suffered considerably from the impact of changes in architectural styles. I'm running a little over time. I need to quickly run through the history of the Indiana Limestone Institute itself and discuss with you, we can have a black slide now, please, discuss with you the promotional efforts and their effects on the sale of Indiana limestone. The Indiana Limestone Institute was founded in 1928. It was the outgrowth of the Quarrymen's Club. The late 20s were great trade association years. And through its efforts, the Indiana limestone industry has, in my opinion, I'm the last, the present of perhaps 8 predecessors. The Indiana limestone industry has achieved a bigger piece of construction pie than it would have had these promotional efforts not been made at on a rather broad basis. From 1928, with very little cessation through the present. In 1973, an organization called the Indiana Limestone Promotional Trust Fund was formed, and this amalgam of labor and management breathed the breath of new life into the Indiana limestone industry, because it was an agreement written on the contract, labor contracts, to for both labor and management to put money into this organization, which transferred it to the Indiana Limestone Institute to promote the product. Since that time, the sale of Indiana limestone in a time of decreasing architectural sales, people who are not in the construction business may not realize that the construction industry had as close as you can come to a depression without being so listed in Wall Street Journal from 1973 through early 1976. Exactly the years when the Promotional Trust Fund and the Indiana Limestone Institute amalgam were selling more Indiana limestone than they reasonably should have. Simply saying basically what I've been saying to you without the barbs to architects. Bill, I see you sitting up there, and I'm going to say something nice about you yet. Nonetheless, in 1931, the Indiana limestone industry sold about 10 million cubic feet, and in 1977, about 2 million cubic feet. That's an example of the effective change from architectural standpoint and the effect of promotion, because the matching statistic relates to 1976, when about 1.5 million cubic feet were sold. And the Indiana Limestone Institute and the Promotional Trust Fund take a great deal of credit for it, and I think they have it coming. Let me have the next slide, please. The environmental advantages or disadvantages of Indiana limestone. Oh, well, we can't read that one anyway. This is an example of an ad run by the International Masonry Institute, and the caption says, "You set stone with your hands and with your heart." Let me have the next slide, please. And the next one. And the next one. That's a building. It's built of aluminum. Presumably the architect belonged to the crushed tuna can school. Aluminum is an energy-intensive material. Let me have the next slide, please. These glass towers are built of an energy-intensive material that has a double dose for you, because not only does it cost a lot of BTUs to change sand to glass, once you get the glass in the building, it can't keep the sun out or keep the built environment in. This is a problem which is common to all glass and not common to Indiana limestone. I won't want to get technical about it, and I'm running slightly over time anyway. We, the Indiana limestone industry, can prove to architects or to any of you people who would be interested that contrary to popular opinion, Indiana limestone is an energy-efficient material, not merely from the standpoint that it requires fewer BTUs to produce than any of its 4 major competitors, but it acts much better in the wall than is generally suspected by architects. Thank you very much.